Go anywhere in the British countryside, and you'll find yourself in a maze of hedgerows. Tall and twisted ones will separate farm and field. Little ones will neatly mark out a well-tended garden. And even the road itself will probably be bordered by the green walls of a hedge and ditch. Have you ever thought about their history? How did the hedgerow come to be? It's an old story, and one which reflects not only the changing nature of country life, but centuries of folklore and forgotten ways, with fairies and witches and spirits of all kinds peeking out from behind the hedgerow. Let's follow the old country road into the hidden history of the hedge. We used to travel forever, following the seasons, meeting at crossing places like this lake and field, hunting and fishing, gathering the fruits of the forest, moving on with the seasons. How and why we stopped doing this is a mystery, but sometime around 6,000 years ago, we began to adopt a new way of life, possibly driven by the migration of people from mainland Europe, bringing with them new ideas. Farming, cultivating the land, living on the same patch of ground your entire life, instead of merely passing through. We laid claim to the wilds, built homes from timber and stone, and buried our dead there, sometimes under cairns of stone, like these I passed by on a wind-swept mountain path. We also cut down and tamed the woodlands, clearing the land for this new world of cultivation. And here is the first echo of what would become the hedgerow. It's believed that when clearing the land, strips of trees were left in place, thus forming boundaries between field and neighbouring land. These lines of hazel, dogwood and hawthorn, developing new growth forms and not only perfect for boundary marking, but for the natural bounty of berries and nuts. Not to mention, they were naturally windproof, leading to an increased growth of the crops within. Not only this, but these early hedges kept in place the original signature of the ancient woodland, and they became home to a thriving variety not only of wildlife, but of seasonal wildflowers like bluebells and speedwell. New hedges could also be lain. Our ancestors familiar with coppicing, weaving and pollarding wood, and as areas of land continued to expand, so too would the lines of hedges separating and marking them out. And so it continued, with Julius Caesar writing of encountering hedges in Europe in 55 BC, describing the nervy tribe of Flanders as laying hedges by cutting into slender trees and bending them over so that many branches come out along the lengths. They finished them off by inserting brambles and briars, so that the hedges formed a defence-like wall. We also know that hedges were continuing to be laid by the time the Romans came to Britain, with discoveries at Bar Hill Roman Fort in Dunbartonshire, showing bundles of hawthorn, of which had been used to fill in a ditch, before which it had been cut and trimmed, suggesting the management of an earlier hedgerow on the site. The hedge, then, is clearly very ancient indeed, and the origins of the later folklore surrounding them may have begun shortly after their formation. From at least the Anglo-Saxon times, and likely dating far back into the unrecorded past, this world of boundaries was respected by beating the bounds, or physically walking around a boundary and hitting the ground with branches, thus maintaining a mental map of the location of the demarcated areas. But the hedge and tree, flower and animal of which lived there, could also be seen as something far stranger. The land was long thought of as teeming with spirits, with deities present in rivers, lakes and trees of all kinds, and of course, hedges as literal thresholds between the cultivated and the wilderness beyond became of particular interest. This ancient tree I visited had long and twisted roots, and a hollow door of which could easily be seen as a spiritual as well as physical boundary, a literal doorway into a land of what would become known as fairies and nature spirits, a place of communion and otherness, a reminder of the wilderness and the untamed, a domain of the ancestors and the ghosts. Next to this ancient tree was a church dating from the early Norman times, and echoes of pastoral and agricultural life could be found inside. Twisted branches, almost like hedges in themselves, were carved into the font, and painted frescoes, surviving here for hundreds of years, displayed natural and floral scenes, the world of rich nature, plant and crop. There was even a skull and crossbones carved into an ancient grave. The location of hidden treasure? Not likely, but still of great interest, even if only for the rarity of its survival. But perhaps there was something of a momentary death of the hedge during those Saxon and Norman times, as a new infield-outfield system saw a change in the management of land. With one large field laid out and cropped, everything outside of it used only for grazing, leading to much less emphasis on the need for hedgerows. By the time of the Normans, when this church was constructed, the expansion of the manorial system placed even more emphasis on the open field layout, the lords granting tenure of the land, and their serfs working out in open fields, without the need for hedges. This system gained much popularity, with common land being open and to be used by all for the purposes of grazing, of which yet again did not require the laying or maintaining of any form of traditional hedgerow, with some even being destroyed to make room for such open common land, more suitable for use with ox-driven plough, of which was heavy and difficult to turn around, making long strips of open land much more of an ideal space, with teams of oxen being maintained as a joint enterprise between peasants working adjoining strips of land. In 1235, the Statute of Merton was passed by the Parliament of England, and with it came the ability for the lords of the manor to enclose common open grazing land for themselves, so long as sufficient pasture remained for the tenants. This resulted in a new boom of hedgerow planting, with many earlier hedges reinstated and countless new ones laid out according to the rights asserted over them by the lords, thus reorganising the layout of the fields and the wider land. Despite the terms of the statute, however, many of whom had worked the land in the open system found themselves evicted from the land, and by the Tudor period, so much land was enclosed and even taken illegally by the lords that it led to a full collapse of the open field system, sometimes even leading to the depopulation and eventual abandonment of the villages themselves. At Ludlow Castle, I climbed to the highest point of the ruined tower, where views over the pastoral landscape look much the same as they might have done during this period. For the lords, this fertile land presented an attractive way of meeting the ever-increasing demands for wool, and new enclosures, constructed by the laying of hedges, converted the land from arable to pastureland for sheep. Despite the increase in the wool trade, however, the depopulation of villages led to a weak and enfeebled workforce, and authorities soon became concerned that those leaving an abandoned village may turn instead to thievery in order to survive on the roads. Because of this, by the time of Henry VIII, laws were passed to administrative councils to limit the enclosure of land, or even to stop it completely. These tillage acts, as they were known, had the aim of returning the land to tillage, and were signed between 1489 and 1597. That said, those responsible for the enforcing of these acts were the same people of whom, due to their own interests, would be opposed to them, and thus their enforcement was slow at best, entirely ignored at worst. One of the governing bodies was also located at Ludlow Castle, the Council of the Marches of Wales, formed in 1472 by Edward IV. This council would govern the lands of the Principality of Wales, and the castle was the central place of appeal for landowners living in the Welsh countryside. It is quite humbling to think that, within these old walls, sat long-forgotten men, with the power to literally shape the land, to divide the fields with hedges and boundaries, to change forever the face of the countryside with permanent scars, of which would long outlive their own short lives, their names and faces scattered to the wind like dust. Of course, the hardships faced by the peasants on the land as a result of these enclosures was not taken lightly, nor indeed peacefully, and rebellion soon rustled in the villages from soon after these acts were passed. In the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, enclosure was part of a wider issue, and in 1450 Jack Cage Rebellion saw land rights demanded by a growing population, and by 1549 land enclosure was the main issue, with Ketch Rebellion taking centre stage. Here, crowds marched upon the land and tore down the hedges and fences of the enclosures, some of which were found on the land of yeoman Robert Kett. Kett, however, agreed with the rebels that the hedges should be removed, and offered to lead the rioters in support of their common liberty. Along with Kett, the rioters marched 10 miles to Norwich, tearing down hedges and destroying enclosures along the way. They camped out on Mousehold Heath, once a site of the old open field system, and drew up a series of demands, amongst which the ending of the Enclosures Acts, the reclaiming of the rights of commoners, and preventing the exploitation of common land by the lords. When a royal herald arrived on the heath, Kett refused a pardon on the grounds that he and his supporters had broken no laws in taking back the common land, wherein he was branded a traitor. After this, the men marched on Norwich, defeating the Earl of Northampton's army in a 4-day skirmish, resulting in the deaths of over 3,000 protesters. Kett was captured and later hung. The enclosure of land, and the livelihoods of those affected working upon those fields the same way their ancestors had done, was something taken very seriously indeed. Despite these many acts of rebellion, the enclosure of land showed no signs of stopping, and in fact, the practice grew steadily throughout the years, reaching its peak in 1750 to 1820, by which over 200,000 miles of hedges had been planted, often formed from a single species such as hawthorn, some of which still survive today. But hedges did not lay themselves. As well as their formation came the need for ditches at their perimeter, required by the Parliamentary Acts, usually with a planted bank on the inside, the job needing to be completed within 1 year in order to be legally binding. This meant that, for many, the hedge became not only a feature of the land, but a source of employment, expertise, and even lifestyle. Hedging was an art, traditionally winter work, and thus keeping one employed in a season where many other labourers would find themselves without work. Like much in the field of agricultural labour, it was not easy, but was good, honest toil, likely taught from your father from a young age, requiring the mastery of various tools, techniques, and ways of working. These skills could last you for a lifetime. Not merely a job to be done, but a trade to live by. The pay quite possibly poor, but the work of value and meaning, providing a lifestyle and way of being that would be lost on many of us today. Nelson Russell was a legendary hedge layer, of whom practiced the traditional way of hedging, the same style that would have been used up to the 18th century during the heyday of enclosure and hedge laying. His surviving words may tell us something of the world of the hedger and ditcher, a world that many of us might not have even known ever existed.
That is a slasher for cutting out the old brambles and stuff. That is made by Jack Fenner at Boar's Head. And this one is what they call a scoring axe. They used to saw in, with one man sitting on the ground this side and another man sitting on the ground the other side, and they'd saw the tree in the way they wanted it to fall. Piece one is one of the two pieces. The other piece is down below it that come from the same stud and come the opposite way, right along here. This is the same piece, all of this and this, so that one piece and one stud strengthened and covered 64 feet. There you are, that's all the little shoots coming out all the way along, Ron. Okay, see them? They're all coming out of that one piece. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's over 36 feet. Laid a bigger bit of birch. And thank you for coming down, Ron.
With such traditional ways of working passed down through the years, it should also come as no surprise that the folklore of the hedgerow was not something that would simply vanish, even as industry and machinery crept up onto our farming landscape. The agricultural festivals all speak of spaces between the seasons, times when the veils between worlds are thinner, and the fairies join in the dance and song of the merry ploughboy. The bluebell and hawthorn, mainstays of the hedgerow, have long been regarded as fairy flowers, with the hawthorn connected to the festival of Beltane, the coming of the May Queen on the 1st of May. Witches were also associated with hedges, known indeed as hedge riders, meaning one straddling the boundaries between the worlds, the hedge becoming a symbol of the liminal space between the two, the witch having long lived on the outskirts of the village and familiar with the flowers and herbs of the wayside, finding herself at home in this wild world of the hedge and the field. This should all come as no surprise. One might see the hare disappear into the hedge, as if passing through some invisible barrier. The insects and butterflies gathering on the wild flowers like fairies in flight, coming in and out of our world at will. And of course there is the mystical hedgehog, shown in fairy tales as a wise old teacher, known in folklore as a spirit guide of great wisdom, and again connected with the witch and the literal passing through the hedge into another form. Medieval folklore saw the hedgehog as carrying fruit on its spines, thus carrying off man's spiritual fruit, and in league with the forces of darkness. Hedgehogs are rare today, and to see one, like I've been able to do with a trail cam and a bag of food, can leave one with the strange feeling of communing with the beauties and majesties of nature. The hog coming out of the hedgerow for a short time, showing itself to us, before scurrying back into the dark world of the wilds. Following the Second World War, the Agriculture Act of 1947 offered a financial incentive for the increased use of machinery on farms, in an effort to achieve greater food independence. This resulted in a great loss of the traditional hedgerow, making more room for crops and creating the space needed for the new world of large machinery, of which could not operate in the small fields divided by hedgerows. Farming was changing, becoming bigger and noisier. Would the traditional skills of the hedger and ditcher be forgotten? The old myths and legends left to fade away, save in whispered impressions in children's fairy tales? It was not to be so. In the 1970s, Dutch elm disease wiped out over 60 million mature elm trees, the only survivors being those of which had been trimmed as part of hedgerows, of which today are the stronghold of the entire species. Furthermore, in 1992, it became illegal to burn the stubble or crop residue, a practice of which had been found to damage hedgerows. And in 1997, the Hedgerow Regulations Act made it an offence to remove a hedgerow without official permission. The reason for this is simple. The loss of hedgerows is a serious factor in the loss of the plant and animal species of whom live within them, many of which have dwelt there since the earth was young and the first farmers settled upon the land. That said, neglect and damage are still a threat to our wonderful hedgerows, with over-reliance on mechanised trimming resulting in a large-scale, quick cutting of all the hedges on a farm, but reducing the number of hedges that are laid and managed. The hedges themselves not able to withstand this level of intensive trimming, without a slow deterioration of their quality. In 2007, a survey found that less than half of the remaining hedges were still in good structural condition. For all our progress, we can perhaps learn something from those first farmers, who managed to live alongside the wilderness, respecting those things of which existed before man walked upon the earth, and will exist once more when man walks on earth no longer. Or those traditional countrymen like Nelson Russell, of whom lived their long lives in the quietude of those old and honest things. Perhaps it's not all lost though. The National Hedge-laying Society still offers courses today in those traditional ways. The charity dedicated to the management of hedgerows, both old and new. Today, of course, the hedgerow is everywhere. It could be the privet hedge of a country dwelling, sometimes cut into an elaborate and mesmerising shape. Or it could be even a type of tourist attraction, the hedge maze having attracted tourists since the wilderness garden was introduced, here referring to a place to walk and meander, popularised by King William III, of whom often walked through Hampton Court Gardens with devoted wife Mary II. We love losing ourselves in these kind of attractions, today of which are often filled with exciting features, statues or other types of scenery. Above all else, we all respect the hedge and the boundary of which it represents. Even in the suburbs, where hedges are often replaced by stone walls, the boundaries between one home and the next is clear-cut and always respected. To walk through a boundary is to enter a private domain, land of which, not being ours, we must treat with the care it demands. Even where the old hedges have been removed, we can still see echoes of them, such as here, where the old hedge has been replaced with a modern metal gate. But peer behind, and the lines of trees once forming part of a hedge are still visible. The hedge is still today a grand and wonderful thing, a symbol of the British countryside to many, and for all of us, a reminder of the comfort and security of boundaries and private spaces, of long-lost folk tales that we still recognise in the poetry and fairy tales that we so lovingly read, and of a common natural world, of which, no matter how many hedges we lay upon it, we all inhabit together and share.
'Cause I be a true-bred country chap. Me father comes from Fairham, and me mother she's got some more like I, and she well knows how to rear 'em. Some people calls I bacon fat, and others termit's head, but I can prove that I bean't no clad, although I'm country bred. For I can drive a plough and milk a cow, for I can rip her mow. I'm as fresh as the daisies that grows in the field, and they calls I Buttercup Joe.